the session 2 of day 2. This session is titled as Internet Governance, Current Issues and Emerging Challenges, a recap from APRIGF 2020, ICANN 69 and IGF 2020. So yesterday you have learned that the internet governance ecosystem is fairly complex with a number of organizations participating and playing their own roles. But the biggest three of these, out of the top 5, these are 3 of them, would be the IGFs, regional and the global, and ICANN. So the regional IGF was held virtually last month, and ICANN was also held last month. IGF was, as you learned yesterday, was just over last week. So we have 3 very eminent veterans who are going to summarize, discussions from these events, and also add on any other comments that they have about the emerging challenges and current areas of discussions. So we have Rajnesh Singh from ISOC, but he's also the chair of APRIGF, Asia Pacific Regional IGF. Rong heads ICANN in Asia Pacific. And we have Jennifer, who is from DotAsia, but was on the MAG of IGF until this particular meeting. So it's my pleasure to welcome them on your behalf. Each of them will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a quick round of questions from the audience. So over to you, Raj.
Right, thank you, Satish, and good afternoon, evening, and maybe even morning for some of you, depending on where you're connecting from. So it's a pleasure to join you today, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me in for this session. Of course, as I was reflecting earlier today on what I would speak about today, it did occur to me that if we did not have the pandemic to deal with, of course, APSIG and APRIGF would have been co-located with each other. So that would have indeed brought together some interesting synergies. However, the pandemic has had multiple effects around the world, obviously. And one thing that has been good, of course, is that the world basically turned to the internet to try and see how they could continue with some semblance of normal life. I must say that the internet itself has, it shaped up pretty well. There were a lot of concerns in the early stages, if you recall, whether the internet would actually hold up to all the demands and stresses that would be put onto it as a result of people working from home, people learning from home, people staying at home because of social movement restrictions and so on. But it's been obvious that the internet itself has coped really well. Now, one of the reasons the internet has, of course, coped so well is because much of the internet, in fact, just about all of it that really matters, is built on open standards, which means anything can connect to anything else and anything can interoperate with anything else, assuming everyone follows those open standards. And that, I think, has really come to the fore during this pandemic, because if we didn't have this level of interoperability, I think life would have been very, very difficult. So, I'd like you to just reflect on that as well. Imagine if the internet was not what it is today. For some of you, I take it most of you are of the younger generation, but perhaps there's some of you on this call who are of an older vintage like myself and Satish and others. You would remember in the good old days, even the computer networking environment was very segregated. Depending on which company you went with, whether you were using Novell or something else, you had your own little ecosystem, or IBM's Token Ring as another one, for instance. They were all discrete, networks, if you like, and all. But if you contrast that to what we have today with the internet, it's vastly different. It doesn't really matter what device you use or what operating system you use. The internet is what connects us all together. So that's why I think the larger ecosystem that exists around the internet is very important. Of course, Satish mentioned ICANN as the administrator of names and numbers, and my good friend Jiarong will speak later. But as well, there are the internet governance forums, which have evolved over time. Now, I won't speak about the IGF because my another good friend Jennifer will, I'm sure, talk all about that. So I will just focus my comments on the regional IGF. The regional IGF itself obviously has its origins in how the global IGF came about. But the key word in the regional IGF is regional. We focus on what are the regional issues that we need to handle. Now, one thing is we must realize is that the Asia Pacific itself, of course, is half the world. So within our geography, we have great diversity. If you look at an economic level, we have the most developed states in the world. We also have the most least developed. We have landlocked states. We have small island states. So there's a huge diversity we have, and each of those have their own very unique challenges and issues that they need to discuss. So that's where I think a regional IGF really comes into play. If we go further down the stack, if you will, we are also, of course, promoting the need to have national and local IGF discussions. Now, I'm hoping we can cover a bit of that later in the Q&A, perhaps. But very quickly on the regional IGF itself. So this year was the 11th year that we held our event, and every year the APrIGF has, of course, grown in stature, visibility, and its profile. The event itself was supposed to be held physically in Kathmandu, Nepal, but obviously due to the pandemic, we couldn't do that. So we held it completely online. Now that in itself obviously brought some challenges, but also showed us what is actually possible with the internet if we put our minds to it. Now, in terms of the event itself, I would invite you to look at APRIGF.Asia, which is the website for the regional IGF, where you will find a whole lot of information, including video archives, not just from this year, but from previous years. There's also a whole lot of content that you will see there, which you may find useful. Now, I won't get into actual IG topics. You've all been involved in this APSIG meeting already. Most of you, from what I understand, already have some sort of background in the internet space. So I don't think it's very useful for me to go over all that. What I will go over, however, is what we did at the IGF this year. The overall theme was Internet Governance for Good, Norms, Standards, and Mechanisms. I know that's a pretty, wide-ranging theme, if you will. So under that, we had 4 sub-themes, which covered cybersecurity, safety, and trust, digital inclusion, gender equality, and diversity, human rights and ethics, and innovation and development. Now, from those 4 topics, you can see that, each has its own relevance to the wider internet space. Now, one other thing I should point out, the internet itself has evolved over time from being what was a research and academic network, or initially, obviously, for military purposes, but then on to academic and research, and then on to the mainstream it is today. Now, together with that, what we've also had is the fact that there are many dimensions to what the internet means to people. If we look at it from the purely technical standpoint, it's all what we need to do to make the internet work and connect to each other and send bits and bytes across whatever communication medium may exist. But if you look at the landscape today, it's vastly different. That's why you saw us discussing, and we have for a number of years now at the regional IGF as well as the global IGF, we've brought in these other topics which are so critical for the overall evolution of the internet itself, because it's no longer just technical infrastructure. It's what we do with it that really matters. And as you can imagine, a lot of the discussions we had during the event were influenced by the pandemic itself. And within that, I think there's some different dimensions to the pandemic and how it had an effect on the internet. Now, earlier I mentioned about how there was concern on how core internet infrastructure would cope with the effects of the pandemic and people using it more. But beyond that, I think another big issue that came into play, and we had lots of discussions around this at the APrIGF, was the fact of issues around privacy and data. Now, a lot of governments around the world started introducing various types of contact tracing apps, but most of them were heavily flawed because what we saw was that, the world has not dealt with a pandemic of this nature and scale for over 100 years now. So, and of course, when the world did deal with it back then, and none of us were around then, obviously, it was a very different time and place. And now, with the way the internet is, with the way travel mobility is, the way we're all interconnected with each other, the effects were very much different.
Raj, 2 minutes.
Yep, sure, thanks. And privacy itself, of course, became an important rallying point for many people around the world, because when these apps and other forms of contact tracing were rolled out, not enough attention was paid to how they would actually protect user privacy. I think the priority for governments was, how do we ensure that the infection doesn't spread, as opposed to trying to safeguard people's privacy and data protection issues and so on. So obviously that was an issue. Then we had the rights component. Now, if you happen to live in an urban area which is well connected anywhere in the region or beyond, you are sort of okay. But if you happen to live in a rural area, there were a greater level of impact that you had to go through as a result of the pandemic. So, seeing that I probably have just about a minute left, I won't go any further into that, and perhaps we can talk about that during the Q&A. One thing I do want to mention very quickly, which is somewhat related to what I've just mentioned about all the issues and dimensions we had to cover. The Internet Society earlier this year released a thing called the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. Now, that is, to ensure that the Internet continues doing what we want it to do, it's very, it's critical to ensure that the Internet itself is able to evolve in the manner it should. The more restrictions we place on how it can grow or how it can connect to other things, people or devices or countries, we will potentially dampen, the utility of the Internet itself. So this toolkit, and I'd invite you to also look at the ISOC website, internetsociety.org, which has this available as a free download. It's basically an assessment tool to help policymakers, technologists, as well as Internet users to try and analyze how decisions and trends can impact the architecture of the Internet. As you would appreciate from what you've from your own backgrounds in this space, that the architecture of the Internet is one of the reasons the Internet itself has been so successful. Once we start tampering with that, I think we start running into lots of problems, and we start going down a very slippery slope. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to engage with you all in the Q&A section or Q&A section or through the chat window. But once again, congratulations to the organizers for this event, for using virtual technologies to make this happen. And I look forward to hearing from my other panelists and, of course, to the discussion later on. Thanks very much, Satish.
Thanks very much, Raj. And we are aware that you're in a very late time right now, but still, please stay until the end of the session for the Q&A. I now request Rong to address us. Rong from ICANN Asia Pacific. Can we have the slides on, please?
Thank you, Satish. And I'm Rong. I'm calling in from Singapore. I'm based here. Very happy to be able to join everyone, albeit virtually. Hope everyone can hear me all right, and hoping to see the slides as well.
We can hear you well and see you as well.
Thank you. All right. So I'll echo a couple of points that Raj made. So first of all is, we're part of this internet community, and I'm very proud to be amongst this community. And I'm very proud that you are also very interested in being our community as well, particularly during this year, because imagine if we had to go through a global pandemic without the internet. Life would have been very different. I think a lot more lives would have been lost to begin with, and how we would have been impacted would have been significantly different. We wouldn't be able to do this clearly, and that really showcases how important and how crucial the internet is for us now today. And I'm very happy and pleased that we have such a large group of passionate community members such as yourself who want to be a part of how the internet is going to evolve and be shaped in the future. And I encourage you to continue to work with us on that. The second broad point really is on that the internet and how it's governed, it's continuing to be, it's only going to be more complicated. So that only means that we as a community also need to be able to keep up with what's going on, be able to differentiate and understand the differences. So for example, in the internet governance space, it's important to understand the difference between governance of the internet, which tends to focus more on the unique identifier, the infrastructure area, which is more on the ICANN, IETF aspects of internet infrastructure, as well as governance on the internet, which tends to focus a lot more on things like applications, new technologies related to applications, as well as the other areas such as human rights, etc. But they are getting more and more linked to one another, and it's important to know the difference between the two and to see how they interact with one another. So that's something I want you to know, because when I'm going to go through some of the points in my own slides, you will see a kind of a crisscross between the two spaces. And it's important for us to realize this, that it's getting more complex, and for us to be able to participate and to contribute actively, we have to know the differences and we have to be able to articulate them. So I thought that is important for you to take away as a background. Now let's go to the next slide, please. So my brief is to cover recently what happened at the most recent ICANN meeting, which is ICANN 69. It was held virtually. It's called an AGM, our annual general meeting, because we have leaders that step up during the AGM, and we have leaders that would step down during that time. So it was held in October. Basically, it was held kind of like over a 2-week plus period, almost 3 weeks period. 1 week of prep week, followed by almost 2 weeks of community meetings, then the actual meeting itself. So overall, 100 sessions of over a long period of time. This was a different format from how we usually do it, because usually we would do it over 6 days. But in this situation, the community tried a different format. All in all, there are mixed feedback about the format, but let's go to the substance as soon as we can. Now, participation had over 2,000 users of the mobile meeting app, which was quite large. We had 3 plenary sessions covering, let me just share my own, covering domain name business, DNS abuse, and WHOIS changes and impact to end users and public safety. I'll go to that in a little bit. Now, the bottom row, we also had the inaugural Dr. Tariq Kamal Capacity Building Award. The recipient was from the African region. And I'm hoping eventually we'll have somebody from our region who will be a recipient of this award as well. In fact, we can nominate somebody from our community who organized something like APSIG, because they're very involved in capacity building. So big hint there. Middle column, bottom row, we recognize 44 community leaders for their service across all of our stakeholder organizations and advisory committees. Then we also showed some gratitude to our long-standing board member, Chrissy Spain, who's from Australia, for 9 years of his service on our board of directors. Now let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Right, in terms of participation, the time zone was largely in the Hamburg time zone because ICANN 69 was meant to be held in Hamburg, but our participation was all right, close to 20% from our region. Next slide, please. Now, here are the major themes, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail here. Well, the first is on the evolution of and next steps of the ICANN's multi-stakeholder model of governance and policy making. Now, I've mentioned already that in the internet governance space, it's becoming more and more complex, in certain ways more complicated. And also the question of, is the multi-stakeholder model effective? Well, the large short story of it is yes, it still works. It's proven to work and it still works. Now the question is, as things continue to evolve, the issues continue to evolve, the technologies evolve, and so on. Is the model going to be able to work? Or should we continue to try to help to evolve it as we go along? So that is one key question for us. And I think it's a big question for every other platform as well. Our next bullet point here is on developments and trends in combating DNS abuse. Now, even the definition of the term DNS abuse took a long time for our community to agree, because we have community members who are very specific to the DNS space, who do not agree with a broader community who think that DNS abuse should cover other areas as well. So the definition of DNS abuse is, the community took a long time to come to terms with agreeing on that definition. Well, largely, we have more or less agreed to it. And so the question is really, how can we work together on combating DNS abuse going forward? Now, a third area here would be all the policy discussions across the stakeholder supporting organizations and advisory committee structures. Here are some of the key topics that are being discussed at ICANN right now. The first one is new GTLD subsequent procedures. Basically, if you've been in our space, you would know that we have a new GTLD round in 2012. What that means is it avails of new generic top-level domains, GTLDs. That means that you can have more than .com, .net, .org. You can have like .microsoft, .alibaba, .amazon, even domain names in your own scripts. And that opens up a lot of avenues for users. That was the first round. And the question is, okay, what are we going to do in the next round, a second round, if we were to open that up? So this is a current policy discussion.
2 minutes.
Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. The discussion now is that we are at the final report. So we are looking at closing this policy discussion. So the next stage will be to implement it. And we can expect in a couple of years, we might open up a new round going forward. There are a few other points here. Maybe I'll just jump to 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth one here, expedited policy development process for GTLD registration data. Very long name. In short, the European GDPR had an impact on ICANN's WHOIS system. The WHOIS system tells you who owns which domain names. Law enforcement agencies use this system to track down bad guys. Bad guys that sell child pornography or illegal pharmaceuticals. They use our system to shut down bad websites. But with GDPR, because we have to redact some information, law enforcement agencies themselves can't use the system to track down the bad guys anymore. Now, for ICANN, we are continuing to discuss how do we adjust the WHOIS system such that it is compliant with GDPR on the one hand, but on the other hand, available for key stakeholders like law enforcement agencies to use the system for their purposes. So this is a very complicated issue, as you can see, because GDPR is not an internet infrastructure targeted policy or regulation. But on the other hand, its impact spilled over into our space. And that's the main point I was trying to make just now. So I would like to highlight that for you to be aware that more and more of such conversations are happening right now. Now, I won't go into detail for the others, so let's skip to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if you miss a session, we'll be sharing the slide. So if you miss a session, you can go to the links here. Let's go to the next slide. And continue to participate with us. If you're from our region, please keep in touch with me. We have our ICANN meetings, and hopefully with the vaccines coming up, we'll be able to travel again, and I'll get to see you face to face. You can apply for ICANN fellowship, and that will allow you to travel to an ICANN meeting. If not, when we are continuing to hold meetings virtually, you can join our meetings there as well. You can learn from our online platform called ICANN Learn. And within the region, we also have an academy called the Asia Pacific Internet Governance Academy, APIGA. We partner with our Korean partner, KISA, and we do that in Korea every year. Hopefully, we can hold the 2021 run in Korea as well. So if you're under 35, you can sign up for that. Every 2 months, we have an APEC Space meeting for our community members to come together to talk about ICANN meetings, ICANN topics. And we also have local readouts. They're held locally in India, China, Japan. So if you're from those communities, do keep in touch with us. And I think that really pretty much sums it up. Let's go to the last slide. Yep, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rong, for that excellent summary of ICANN 69. I think it highlights the complexity of discussions. Although the remit of ICANN is narrow, the discussions are deep. So we now move on to Jennifer, who will talk to us about IGF. And you have heard Henriette yesterday, and this will be a little more in detail about the IGF. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Satish. I hope you can see my screen and also hear me.
Yes, to both.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Chung. I work for DotAsia, but as Satish introduced at the very beginning, I'm also an outgoing MAG member for this year, as the meeting just concluded yesterday, actually. We had the final session of open mic, not yesterday, the day before. My times are very, very strange right now because in times of pandemic. I'm actually coming to all of you from New York. I'm based on the other side of the world right now to all of you, but I'm very happy to be able to see everyone and meet everyone virtually here in this edition of APSIG. So I wanted to echo a few points made by Rong and also Raj, that it is so important right now that we talk about internet governance, because COVID-19 has turned a lot of our lives and our economies entirely online. And the discussion on internet governance issues are not just about the internet anymore. And it's really very tightly linked to everybody's everyday life. What we talk about in policy here, what we talk about in different rights, different emerging technologies, all of this has immediate impact on the way we have been living our lives for the past year, and probably in the coming immediate future or short-term future as well. So very happy to see everyone here. A little bit about the Internet Governance Forum. I don't want to go too much into detail about the history or the background of where it all came from. I do have a slide here that kind of shows you that it's not a recent development. You can see all these different logos. It actually all the way came back in 2000, where we had the 8 Millennium Development Goals. But through the different phases, you can see right now we are in 2020, and this is the 15th IGF. Going forward for this process, I think a lot of you who are in this space know that there's been the UN Secretary General Roadmap for Digital Corporation issued this year. And in this roadmap, he talks about strengthening the IGF processes in what is called IGF+. So looking forward to what might be coming ahead would be an evolution of what we already know, with more ties to the UN institutions, more ties to a lot of the sectors that people don't traditionally associate with the internet or internet governance, and also more ties to stakeholder groups who are also not traditionally looked at being included before in internet governance. And I think this was also stressed very much, I think it was 2 years ago, in IGF Paris, when we had the Paris call, and also the first time we had the UN Secretary General speak to us at the IGF. This is another part of the history that I don't really want to go through. You can look it up online, but this is basically giving you the context and the mandate from which the internet governance was founded. So about this year, as a lot of other events, including the ICANN meetings, including RightsCon, including the regional IGFs, which Raj mentioned, the Asia Pacific Regional IGF, a lot of these events have come online, and so has the global IGF. In fact, it's very interesting to see this because the platform on which we are currently using for all these meetings is specifically the platform that we discuss all the policy about. So it's actually quite fitting and apt that we do this. A little bit about the process of each IGF cycle, and this is the same whether it was this interesting year 2020 or previous years. Each IGF cycle starts with open bottom-up online consultations where we want to hear from the public the issues they find most important for them. And through these consultations, which I believe will still be 2 times, there will be one next year at the end of February and then one mid-year. The community is invited to actually speak directly at a very intensive 3-day or 4-day MAG meeting. And then throughout the year as well, there's also issues and public consultation when we want to hear more from the community on how to correctly frame the IGF agenda for the year. So the MAG is the multi-stakeholder advisory group. This year we had, this past year we had 49 members. I think going forward for 2021, there'll be only 40, but the actual stakeholder group distribution is kept, and so is the regional representation and also the stakeholder representation. For the cycle this year, we had one face-to-face open consultation and MAG meeting. I think that was back in January when a lot of the region, not the Asia Pacific region, but a lot of the other regions were not in lockdown yet. So we did actually have a face-to-face meeting at the very beginning of this year in Geneva. And then the second one in mid-year became a virtual meeting. And I think at that time, both the IGF Secretariat, the MAG chair and the MAG realized that, you know, having the IGF, the global IGF, is better than not having the global IGF, because there was talk about not holding it. But I think it was more important for us to maintain that this is extremely important to have this year. And then it took us to this meeting. So first IGF ever online, there were 2 phases. And I think in a lot of meetings this year that changed from the physical to the virtual, we have noticed that, you know, the length of time has kind of stretched, where in the past IGF is usually all done in 1 week with 1 day 0, and then there was 4 or 5 meeting days. This year, it's kind of stretched over 2.5 weeks, with the first phase being from the 2nd to the 6th of November, and then the second phase from the 9th to the 17th, with the final open mic on Wednesday of this week. That being said, having it stretched over this period is actually, we've heard good feedback and also feedback that it's too much, but I think a lot of events, including the IGF this year, has been trying to balance this kind of participation. So the overarching theme for IGF this year is Internet for Human Resilience and Solidarity, which is quite appropriate given this year. And we had 4 main thematic tracks. You can see in the second bullet, it was data, inclusion, trust, and environment. And I've particularly highlighted environment because it is a new theme for the IGF this year, or the IGF in general, but it is not a new theme for the global community. You know, concerns about the environment has been on top of our minds for past several years, past several decades as well. But in terms of internet governance, this is the very first time we put the highlight on this very important theme. And without this theme, I think it was felt by the MAG and also the global community that we would not be able to reach the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So highlighting this is something that we also hope bringing forward to next year and the years to come, the importance of environment as a theme in IG. Another thing that was interesting this year, thank you, Satish. Another thing that was interesting this year was that we had a particular highlight on youth. We had the first ever youth summit this year, And we strengthened the youth participation and representation in phase 2 in the high-level sessions and the main sessions, and also there was a series of youth flash sessions. That going forward, I think next year in Poland as well, Poland as a host country is extremely interested to kind of up-level and put the highlights on youth participation. So I hope this trend also continues in the IGF meetings subsequent to that as well. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, this year is also the year when we had the UN Secretary General Roadmap for Digital Cooperation that was publicized and published. I think it was mid-year. And looking at one of the particular recommendations is strengthening the IGF processes to something called the IGF Plus. I won't go into too much detail about the particular recommendations, working groups, roundtables, and all the input documents. I'll drop the link later for you guys to look at, but it is very interesting to know that, you know, even the IGF ecosystem and process is in evolution, and we look more to strengthening ties with different sectors, different stakeholder groups, things that kind of bring us all together, because we are more and more interconnected, as we can see this year. And then the last one that I wanted to highlight was we had the first ever call for voluntary commitments from IGF participants to further the goals. And this is something that you can think of as, you know, you might say, oh, you know, I'm just going to say I will pledge to do this, that, and the other, and it's just lip service. But it is actually something that we hope to revisit in the next year, revisit in the next 2 years and 3 years. And it's not just from individuals, it is from pledges from governments, pledges from, I think, private sector, big tech, all of the stakeholders that make IGF run, make IGF community vibrant. And I think it's something that we should really look at fulfilling as well as we go forward. I don't have a final slide, but I will drop links to the outputs, which there are many outputs coming from this year. I think this year is one of the first years that we've had a more organized form of collating and archiving all the different outputs. I think one of the main criticisms of the IGF and the IGF process is, you know, what are we going to do? Are we just going to meet and talk about something once a year and then, you know, we forget about it? That's actually not true. There is a lot of intersessional work that's being done. So I will also drop the link to all the IGF 2020 outputs, and also how you can continue to participate in these outputs as a community member or future MAG member, and also drop my email and contact information as well. And look forward to hearing from all of the participants in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, for the developments in the IGF, especially the IGF Plus, as well as the voluntary commitment, which is very interesting. So it will be interesting to watch how this develops further. We will now open up for questions. So we have several questions in the chat, and we have about 8 minutes to go. The first question, I would restate the question slightly, with your permission, and it's basically about the actual statement is about the common gaps or points among stakeholders. So what I understand from the question is, given the fact that the multiple stakeholders of the multi-stakeholder model are pulling in different directions, how does the community get to decide on things? What is the consensus process? It's open to any of the panelists. But please stick to 1 minute so that everybody can speak. So Raj, Rong, and Jennifer, please respond to this question.
Thanks, Satish. So indeed, you know, one of the challenges of the multi-stakeholder process, of course, is how do you ensure that you know, all points are taken into account when you reach a decision or a consensus, for that matter. You know, I think in the earlier stages it was probably a bit easier when people basically came from a very small number of backgrounds. But I think as that group has evolved, as that number of people have increased and their backgrounds have also changed, frankly speaking, this is my personal opinion here, the whole multi-stakeholder consensus process is actually getting harder. Because you have sometimes competing points of view, and sometimes you have people who will not actually give way to a common consensus, for instance. So if people are not prepared to have, to give and take, then it's very difficult to reach consensus. Then you may have rough consensus, as an example, which means it's not consensus of the whole group, but largely speaking, it's consensus. So I think it's still an evolutionary process. But one thing I think the multi-stakeholder process does do, it gives people a voice in the process, and that if you've been involved with regulatory processes in the good old days, for the lack of a better term, you would know that it was very top down and usually only included, if we're talking about the telecom world, the incumbents, for instance, the big telecom operators. But now, at least with the multi-stakeholder model, and lots of governments are using that now, particularly for consultation processes, that at least gives you a voice that can be heard. And oftentimes that voice is actually also action. So, I think it's got a very important role to play. And I think we need to keep on trying to see how we can better the process.
Thanks, Raj. Rong.
Thank you. Just adding on to what Raj mentioned, so totally agree with everything that he has said. One of the key areas about the multi-stakeholder model is that it is to work towards consensus. So sometimes one problem is some stakeholders don't really understand this. So they'll come into a multi-stakeholder platform, be it ICANN, or IGF, or IETF, for example. And they're just coming to restate their position over and over and over again. But they're not really working towards finding consensus. Then you're not really trying to find a solution to the problem. That's where things get stuck as a result. So what's important also as a takeaway for this group is when you're participating in the multi-stakeholder model, it is to help one another find consensus. So be able to listen, understand each other's positions. How do we solve the problem? How do we come to agreement? So that's something that's very important, which sometimes this point gets overlooked very easily.
Thanks, Rong. Jennifer?
Thanks, Satish. I think Raj and Jarong already made the points that I really wanted to emphasize on the multi-stakeholder model and the cooperation and how we come to consensus. I think one thing that we also have to remember is, at least in the IGF process, all of these stakeholders that make up the different stakeholder groups do come together at, on equal footing. And I think this is really interesting because in a lot of other forums and a lot of other venues, a lot of other sectors, people do emphasize very much, the governmental role is very different. But here in IG, in internet governance, and especially in the internet governance forum processes, we are all coming together on equal footing. And it's very rare to be able to sit at the same table and talk with these issues with people who represent different states. So I think we need to remember also, in this whole process, you also have an equal say, whether you come from the tech community, private sector, civil society, or governments.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so the second question is on GDPR, but I think it's been answered in chat. So we will move into the third question, which seems to be about voluntary guidelines or best practices or expected standards of behavior on the internet, so that I think we've seen the question. So Raj, would you like to go first on this?
Sorry, Satish, what was the actual question?
The question is, during COVID-19, we have observed a lot of new netizens connecting to cyberspace. My question is how IGF use digital etiquette, digital code of conduct in Asia Pacific for more healthy internet for the next billion.
Okay, so I think the easiest way for me to answer that is with this. That saying that goes that with great power comes great responsibility, right? So if you have come onto the internet, you've seen all the great things that are possible with it, either from peers, friends, or otherwise. Be responsible in how you use it. So that level of education and awareness is very critical. For a lot of those people who newly connect, I think it becomes a whole new world, and sometimes they get carried away with things. I mean, a classic example is fake news and misinformation that is proliferating in a lot of countries in this region in particular. So, you know, that having that sense of responsibility is very important. One other thing, and some of you have heard me speak before, would have heard me say this already, the reason humans are different, you know, we are at the top of the chain when it comes to the animal kingdom, is because we have brains that can employ critical thinking. So please don't forget that critical thinking is the reason we are human beings, and we have achieved so much compared to other members of the animal kingdom. So, you know, we need to ensure that, you know, we employ critical thinking when we see, read, or hear things, and not just get carried away by those. So responsibility, number one. Number two, critical thinking. Thanks.
All right. So I think we have to stop now because we are out of time. So we still have several questions to be answered, but unfortunately, it is already eating into the break. So I'd like to thank the panelists for a very interesting session. There are still a number of questions that have come up, which we hope to discuss in the sessions that follow. Thank you once again, especially Raj, who's in a very late time zone now. We will see you in later editions of this process, and thanks very much for your support, all the three organizations.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, and all the best to all of you. Cheers.